I want to jump ahead about a thousand years to the English Poor Laws. What existed between then and that? A lot. In the thousand years before that, you had the Crusades, right? You know about the Crusades. We had the beginnings of Islam, which was about 650, middle 600s. You had the Crusades. But you also had feudalism. And feudalism is an interesting concept. I'm going to hang myself with this, aren't I? I can't reach over to the board. Can I? Yeah, I can. Okay. And feudalism existed in Europe really for about 1,000 years in feudalism. It's a long period of time. And it was, in some measure, it had a social welfare function. And I'll explain to you what I mean. If you looked at, some of you, anybody been to Europe? You have. All right, do you remember the castles and the feudal estates and so on? And the way it was set up is it kind of looked like this. And so you had this piece of land, and it was typically bordered by natural things, a river, a forest, a meadow, whatever it was. And then in the middle of here, you had the manor house. This is where the lord of the manor lived. The lord of the manor was the one who basically owned this. Okay? And he was a lord. And then around it here, you had tenant farmers, and but they were really serfs. Okay? And sometimes they had a little bit of land just to grow their own stuff, but they basically tilled the land for the lord of the manor. But they weren't just tenant farmers. They could have been goldsmiths. These were like villages, really. They were big estates. So it could have been a silversmith, a blacksmith, a tinsmith, and also a farmer, and so on. Now, in return, the farmers or the tinsmith gave what they produced to the lord of the manor, who then gave them something back, enough to subsist on, to live on. Okay? So you had this kind of a balance between the peasants producing and the lord of the manor. Again, the nicest lord of the manor would give them more food. They also had sometimes their own little plot that they could grow their own stuff on. And in return, the lord of the manor was benevolent to them. Now, they couldn't leave. If they left, they could be killed. Serfs had to stay on this land. They were indentured servants, more like slaves. And they had to be loyal. Now, some did leave, and they escaped. Because sometimes the lord of the manor was not very good. And when they needed an army, because the king would then say to the lord of the manor, I'm doing this battle or the crusades or whatever I need, so they would, I need men, and so they would go into and they'd grab some of the serfs and turn them into soldiers and move them out. And this was a kind of a balance that existed. And the quid pro quo was, I'm loyal to you, but you're also loyal to me. So when I get old and I can't work anymore, you'll still provide for me. Because what happens if you don't provide for me, then I will run, or somebody else will run. So there's got to be a mutual trust. So when I get old or sick, I know I'm going to get enough food to eat. Now, if there's a drought or something happens, you're not going to get everybody's going to be hungry. But short of that, I'm going to get food. And you're going to take care of my needs. And I'm going to work for you. It's a nice balance, right? But I'm a slave. Not a slave, a serf. More precisely. I'm a serf. Now, then you had these cities here. Okay? and you had burgers. Not hamburgers, but burgers. You ever hear the last name Burger? You know what burger means? Burger means a citizen. Okay. Yeah, it's a citizen of the ass. I just made that up. Clever of me, though, I must say. Yeah, burger simply means a citizen. Now, you had to be, not everybody could be a citizen. Okay? You had to have permission to go in here. Okay? To live in that city. These were closed. These cities were closed. And they were essentially ecclesiastical. They were basically run by the Catholic Church. They were run by the Catholic Church. They owned most of the property in that city. You couldn't go into that city unless you had special permission, so the serfs could maybe go in during the day, but then they had to come back out at night to go back to their manor. And within the cities, you had, again, this sort of ecclesiastical control, the monasteries and the church, but you also had guilds. And guilds are basically like a union in some ways, except that, for example, you had the Shoemakers Guild. If you wanted to make shoes, you had to belong to the Shoemakers Guild. You couldn't compete in price. Shoes had to be the same price. It could be a little bit different style, but you couldn't compete in price at all. And it was tough to get in. How did you get into a Shoemakers Guild? Your father was a shoemaker. Your grandfather was a shoemaker. You apprenticed with a shoemaker, and you got into the guild. Now, it were different guilds. Goldsmiths, you know, the last name Goldsmith. I mean, that's basically people who were in a gold guild. Smiths in the guild. Tinsmiths, shoemakers, harness makers, whatever it was. And the guilds took care of their members. So if you were in a guild and you got sick, the guild would look after you. If you died, the guild would look after your family. A lot of protection, a lot of social protection. Okay? So if, you know, and people died often young. You died young. The guilds would look after your wife and kids for you. And maybe they would let your son into the guild. So your son would then become a shoemaker or whatever that guild particularly was. But these were closed systems. And they were controlled. You couldn't get into them. No? That's why the term burgher or citizen. So you had these two. You had social welfare here, protection here, right? And you had protection here. Some social protection, right? Here the lord of the manor looked after you. Here the guilds looked after you. Or if you were in the city, the church would look after you. Through hospitals and whatever. And this all was in kind of a balance for a lot of years. And then something happened that changed the balance. Two things happened. First, the bubonic plague in the 1300s. It was interesting, they just did a study on the bubonic plague. And I grew up believing, and we all did, that the fleas, you know, bubonic plague was caused by fleas, right? You know that, right? Fleas came. So I was always taught, at least that was conventional knowledge, that the fleas came from rats. The new research suggests the fleas didn't come from rats. They came from people, not from rats. So you could imagine that people didn't bathe very often, and that they had fleas in their hair, in their beards, or whatever. And those fleas, it wasn't the rats. Because you think about it, I mean, how do you get close to a rat? I mean, you know, it's not like you sleep with them at night, you know, like your pet rat. I mean, and so, but what happened was that to avoid the plague, people ran. They ran into the countryside because they realized that, you know, you sort of got it from around other people. So how do you not get it is you just don't go around other people. So they ran away in the country and they sort of hid out or whatever. And that disrupted this, and it disrupted the city. Now, another thing happened. And that is, we had cotton mills and woolen mills. We had the colonies. And the colonies needed goods. And they needed wool. They needed cotton. Or they took the cotton from the colonies and came in here and back and forth. They needed also wool. And they set up these woolen mills. All of a sudden, they realized that wool was more profitable than raising crops. Now, the great thing about wool is you don't need many people, do you? You need a shepherd, right? You don't need, farming is labor intensive, right? You need, it takes a lot to farm. I mean, you don't have mechanized stuff. Whereas shepherd is pretty simple, right? You got a few people that look after the sheep. They cut the drengs, was it dengs off them? The dengs, I think. You know what the dengs are? It's a pretty nasty thing. I don't want to get into it. I know there's some sheep for having lived in Australia and New Zealand, where New Zealand actually has more sheep than people in New Zealand. Anyway, so all of a sudden you don't need all these people because it's more profitable to have wool. So you have what's called the enclosure movement. You started then becoming more concerned about your area, and you started pushing people out. Now, where do they go? Right? Where are they going to go? There's only one place to go. You don't need them on the farms. You're sort of pushing them out, so they go to the cities, right? Now, don't forget the cities are closed, right? So what do? They camp along outside of the city, on the perimeter. Now, remember I said these people are tinsmiths and goldsmiths and shoemakers and so on. So they started making shoes and they started selling them in the city. But they sold them cheaper than the guilds could sell them. Because it was all of a sudden competition, right? The guilds set the prices. You had a pair of shoes, you couldn't sell it beyond a certain price. Now all of a sudden, they would come in and they would undersell them. People being people were always looking for bargains, right? Eventually, the guilds fell apart because they couldn't compete with the prices of people who, were setting different prices. And the cities eventually became open. People started moving into the cities. Moving out from here and into the cities. And then all of a sudden you then had production in the cities. You started producing clothing for the colonies and for other places, and so all of a sudden you had an industrial poor people coming in. By the way, it's very interesting. If you look at Protestantism, which emerged just slightly after that time, you really look at why Protestantism emerged. You think it had to do with religion, right? To some degree. But Protestantism was largely an economic movement. It was less about religion and more about economics. That surprise you? Think about it. Who owned all this land in here? The Catholic Church. Why did Henry VIII become Protestant? First thing they did is they grabbed all the church property, right? Because the church owned huge pieces of property. They were incredibly wealthy. Secondly, the church had usury laws. Right? You couldn't lend money at interest, right? Isn't that right? Among the Catholic Church? Couldn't lend money at interest. Well, that's a real problem, isn't it? Because if you've got a you're trying to start a business and an industry, you need money to start it, right? So where did you get your money? You got your money from the Jews. Because the Jews were not concerned, there was no usury. So you borrowed money from the Jews. Well, all of a sudden, these business people said, wait a minute, we're trying to build a factory to make woolen goods and cotton and so on. We need money. And we're tired of borrowing it from that. We need lots of money. And so what Protestantism said is, hey, there's no such thing as usury. We're going to get rid of usury. They got rid of usury. All of a sudden, there was money. One of the reasons that Catholicism kept usury laws was to make... was to maintain control. Because so long as you had usury laws, you could maintain control of businesses starting up. You could keep your power. Once you started creating companies, not corporations, companies, you lost some of your religious power. And that's part of what happened. It was large, in some measure it was economic. It was getting rid of the usury laws, taking church property back and opening up the market to businesses that were starting. Anybody disagree with that? Think about the logic of that. I'm not saying that theology didn't, but oftentimes when we look at history, the driver is not so much religion or theology, it's economics. No?
So there's a theocratic government, and a protest against the church would be a protest against the government.
Exactly. It would begin against the excesses of the church. I mean, the whole idea that you could pay your way into purgatory and you could pay your way out of purgatory, and, there's a lot of corruption. We see it nowadays as well. I mean, there's anybody that is in a position of power you get corruption, right? Anytime you've got a group that's in the position of power, you're going to have a certain amount of corruption. So you had this breakdown, and now all of a sudden you had all these people coming to the city, some with skills, but some without skills. What does a farmer do in the city? What are the skills that are transferable to a city? Not much, right? There's not much transferable skills. So all of a sudden they were farmers or serfs, and they came into the cities and they were poor. You had this massive poverty, and you had begging, which, by the way, is quite a noble art. We don't think about it, but begging's been around a long time. You had begging. Now you had a problem. Here's the problem. You had the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Remember I talked about that? It killed off about a third of Europeans. Maybe. A lot. All of a sudden you had a shortage. These businesses that were starting up couldn't get enough workers because so many people had died off in the bubonic plague. So, beggars are potentially able-bodied, right? So you want to make sure that you get the able-bodied beggars working. So what do? You make it illegal to be an able-bodied beggar. And you force them into the labor force. We do the same thing now, don't we? Think about it. What was welfare reform? What did welfare reform do? Remember TANF? You studied TANF in 6500, right? What was TANF about? Was TANF a welfare policy? Remember TANF? Temporary aid to needy families. Basically AFDC. What was TANF? What did TANF do?
Gave jobs to the people who needed it.
Is that what you learned in TANF? Okay.
Temporary assistance. They would only give families assistance for 5 years.
That's right. It drove people into the labor market, didn't it? Right? Said you're going to be in for 5 years. You have a clock. When that clock runs out, you're off, with the exception of 20% of the caseload, who are the hardest of the hardcore. Your clock's going to run out, and you're going into the labor market. Now, when did TANF pass? In the middle 90s. Unemployment was at 3.5%. Some of you are too young. Every time you walk by a store, there was a help wanted sign. They couldn't get enough workers. So people were on TANF, people on AFDC, were not working, and you had this shortage of workers. So what you do is you drive people in to the labor force. And I wrote an article several years ago about this. And what I said in the article is I said that TANF was not a welfare policy. It was a labor policy. It was not about welfare, it was about labor. It was about driving people into jobs. Of course, we drove them into crap jobs, because a lot of these jobs were part-time jobs, right, with low wages. And so now people were having to have 2 and 3 jobs to make a living. And one of the reasons that they were part-time jobs is because employers did not want to have to pay health care, right? So if they employed you for less than 20 hours a week, they didn't have to pay health care. So they employed you at 19 and a half hours a week. Didn't have to pay health care. So you moved from job to job to job. You had the 2-3 jobs, so you're running from one shop to the next shop to make up your 40 hours. Okay? Same problem. You had a shortage of workers, and you had people we considered able-bodied being AFDC recipients, so you drove them basically into the workforce. And the same thing happened. So a lot of the English Poor Laws were really about labor market laws. By the way, the bubonic plague of 1349 drastically reduced England's population, leading to King Edward III to create a statute of laborers that fixed maximum wages, so you couldn't make more than a certain thing, placed travel restrictions on the unemployed, so the unemployed had to stay in one place so they would take the jobs that were available. They forced the jobless to work for any employer willing to hire them. That sound like TANF? That's what basically it did. They drove people into the labor force. You had to take the job. And then outlawed alms for the able-bodied. So if you were able-bodied, you didn't get any alms. And in 1531, the English Parliament outlawed begging for the able-bodied. So even the able-bodied could not beg. The passage of the Act for the Punishment of Sturdy Vagabonds and Beggars in 1536 further mandated the English government to assume responsibility for the poor. Now, this is an important concept, okay? And it goes back to social welfare. It's a building block. When you had this, and you had this, you had a responsibility, right? They were responsible for their workers, they were responsible for the guilds, and you had a balance. When this ended, there was no responsibility, right? The church had some, but not much. They couldn't do that much. And so eventually the state had to step in and had to take some responsibility for the poor. And that's what we have, to some degree, what we have now, where the state has responsibility. Now, you ask yourself, okay, I'm a policy analyst. That's what I do. I'm social policy. So you ask yourself, why is it, scratch your head, why is it that the Europeans have such a good welfare state, that they take care of people, and why is the American state so crappy, American welfare state? You go to Europe, you don't see the level of homelessness you see in America. You have child allowances. For every child you get money from the government. You have national health care. It doesn't cost you any money. You go to a doctor and it's basically free. Your medications are heavily subsidized. You have subsidized daycare. You have a good public transportation system, which I consider part of social welfare, by the way. And why is it that the Americans are still struggling with this? One of the theories is because the Europeans had this tradition of the wealthy looking after, the noblesse oblige, the obligation of the wealthy to look after those who were less fortunate that you had in that feudal estate. You see the logic of that? Now, it may not be true, but that's one theory. So all of a sudden you had this. America never had an aristocracy. We never had lords, did we? There was no aristocracy. There was no sense of this noblesse oblige, the obligation to take care of people who are less fortunate than yourselves, because you were wealthy. America had no tradition for that. That's why the Europeans were able to institute a welfare state much more easily than we were. You got the English poor laws. Now, in America, we had a kind of a welfare, some sort of welfare functions, but the biggest welfare function we have in America, biggest function we have, is the westward expansion. What happened to poor people? They went west, didn't they? You always had farmland, right? So people who were poor in the cities, they could move westward, they could establish, to get a farm. Basically, the country gave them farms, gave them land to settle. So you had a natural kind of thing. In colonial America, you had the town that took care of its residents, but only its residents. Okay? And we had something called passing on. What passing on meant that if you were poor and indigent and you went to a town, they would take care of you for a couple of days and then they would put you on a wagon and send you to someplace else. We call that passing on. States are doing that now. I've heard, I sound like Trump, I've heard from people, but I've heard that a number of states ship the homeless to Hawaii. This is what, I don't know if it's true or not, but this is what I've heard. Because you wonder how people get here that are homeless, right? I mean, it's expensive. I mean, you don't just get on a Greyhound and come to Hawaii, right? You got to get on a plane, or a cargo ship, right? So somehow they're getting here. That would be passing on, wouldn't it? They're taking basically some of their low-income and homeless people, if that's what's occurring, and they're sending them to Hawaii. And from here, there ain't no other place to go, right? This is it, isn't it? Where are you going to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go back to what you were talking about with TANF. TANF was established with the Personal Responsibility and Opportunity Act, and it was, I think Bill Clinton was the president.
He was.
And it was passed. So, like for me, I thought that it gave people an incentive,
Mm-hmm.
to work. That's what it was designed to do. So, like, I'm listening, I don't know if it was, you were trying to make it seem like it was a bad thing to force people into labor?
No, it's not a bad thing to force people into labor. And the incentive was, you're right, the incentive was that if you don't get it, that you're going to be off welfare unless you get a job. I mean, that was the incentive. And to some degree, it forced people into really low-wage labor jobs. And the problem was that it didn't provide necessarily training. This was part of the problem. It pushed people into the labor market, but it didn't really train them for better jobs. So they ended up languishing in what I call the secondary labor market. What is a secondary labor market? A security guard. Anybody know anything about security guards? You do.
I was a security guard at one point.
Okay. Were you treated well?
Not really.
Why? No, we're talking about the secondary labor market. And that's where most of these recipients went. Why weren't you treated well?
They just told me what I had to do and get my license, and then pretty much I was on my own. Just enough to do the job.
Okay. My middle son works as security guard here in Honolulu. And the way he's treated, I'm not going to say the agency, but the way he's treated in that job is appalling. Nobody in the primary labor market would tolerate it. They miss a day. They don't pay, because he gets paid by the hour. So he doesn't get paid for holidays, right? You only get paid for the hours you work. All right? That's all. Anytime you're off work, you don't get paid. You don't get paid for a holiday. You don't get paid for Martin Luther King Day. You don't get paid. You get paid per hour. So, for example, in his case, they forget to pay him for a day. or they miss a day in his pay, and he goes to the company and he says, I'm missing a day in my pay, and they said, piss off. Sorry, next time we'll get it right. There's no recourse. You know what I'm saying? There's in a middle class job, you'd go to HR, right? And you'd say, well, I didn't get paid, and HR, I'm going to sue him. There it's not. I mean, in the secondary labor market, you are very dispensable as a worker. You don't like it? There's the door. That's it. Walmart does that. Yeah. Walmart's a secondary labor market job, which is one of the reasons why a lot of cities don't want Walmart in their town, because they're finding that it costs more to have a Walmart there than not, because they end up paying more for Medicaid, because a lot of the Walmart employees are working so few hours that they're eligible for Medicaid and food stamps, and living in low income housing. And Walmart just raised their wages to $11 an hour and fired 7,000 workers. So a lot of these people were pushed into the secondary labor market. Fast food. Anybody work in fast food? Nobody worked. Well, we all grew up with silver spoons in your mouth.
That was my first job.
Your first job. Okay, were you treated well in fast food?
I was.
You were?
I ran at Wendy's.
Okay.
Wendy's too? What's up?
You were lucky. What can I tell you?
Yeah.
And you were probably very good to your employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You're unusual. A lot of the fast food places have not been exactly places where you'd want to work. And it's, again, you're dispensable as a worker. You don't have a lot of protections. You'll work as many hours as they say you're going to work, so you may come in one day and say, oh, you're only working 6 hours this week. And they do that in security guards too, by the way. They'll say, well, we don't have a place for you, or whatever. The secondary labor market's a very different experience, and that's where the TANF people ended up. They ended up in the secondary labor market. They didn't end up as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Anyway, the other thing that happened in colonial America is we had poorhouses. What is a poorhouse? A poorhouse is a place where we put debtors. It's a prison, like a debtor's prison. Now that makes a lot of sense, because if you can't pay a debt, you put somebody in prison to make sure they can't pay the debt, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But a debtor prison was a way to punish people who did not pay their debts. The other thing that occurred in colonial America also is you had indentured servants. I would suspect that a number of your family members came as an indentured servant. And that meant that they were paid to come to work, and they had to work for you for 7 years or 10 years, however long it was, and then you would be free. You would have to pay off. You'd have to pay off your debts and whatever. So you had that in colonial America. Residence requirements, I mentioned warning out or passing on, meant that newcomers were strongly encouraged to move on if they appeared indigent. And passing on was returning the transient poor to their former counties of residence. We do that with TANF benefits, by the way. It's probably still true. Do you know what a AFDC beneficiary was making a month with a family of, I think it was a family of 2 or 3 in Mississippi? Do you know what the monthly AFDC payment was? $144 a month. Can you imagine a family of 3 or 4 living on $144 a month? What was the reason? The reason was go to California. Go to some state where they're going to pay you better benefits. That's a kind of passing on, isn't it? A kind of warning on. Don't stick around here because the benefits are low. The process for helping the poor changed radically by the early 1800s. A reliance on workhouses, which I mentioned. In some cases, the use of outdoor relief was virtually abandoned in favor of institutional care. It was only in the mid-1800s that the federal government conceded even limited responsibility for the poor. And what girded that belief was a feeling that poverty was a consequence of moral weakness. You were poor because of moral weakness. Drinking, gambling, running around. Poverty was a consequence of moral weakness. Because if you were morally strong, you would not be poor, right? Because it was all tied into the fact that one of the ways that God showed that they were happy with you was for you to be financially secure or rich. That was the doctrine. So if you were poor, it meant that God was not very happy with you. Okay. We see the same phenomenon now. Anybody know what the prosperity doctrine is? Never heard of that? Joel Osteen, you know who Joel Osteen is? Ring a bell? What?
The mega church pastor?
Yeah.
in Houston.
Yeah.
Isn't it like if you visualize and if you're good, you can work, you'll be successful for that?
If you give money to the church, if you tithe and you give money to Joel and you give money to the church, you're going to do very well, and you're going to be prosperous. And if you believe, if you're religious enough and you give enough money to the church, you're going to be prosperous. And the fact is that prosperity is a sign that God likes you. So if you're poor, it means, God's not so happy with you. So if you do the right thing and God likes you, you get to be rich. Right? I've done this my whole life and it's not happened. I haven't given money to them, but nevertheless. But that's the prosperity doctrine, and that it particularly appeals to low-income people. Because it's kind of like a lottery. It's like a religious lottery, I mean, if you just, if you give enough money, if you buy enough lottery tickets, right, you'll hit it, right? You ever notice in states that have lottery tickets, who buys most of the lottery tickets? It's not the middle class, it's the poor. You see the poor going into these places with, $50, $60 and they're buying 50 lottery tickets. I bought like 3 lottery tickets in my life. And it's the same thing with the prosperity doctrine. And so this goes back to a belief, in fact, that, what is it? It used to be cleanliness is next to godliness, so I think it's now like wealth is next to godliness. I mean, that was basically the assumption. That's how they rationalize, by the way, the fact that Joel Osteen lives in a $20 million house, of which he has several, and they fly around in their own jet, and they feel and meanwhile the parishioners are relatively poor. I mean, and yet they feel and in fact they justify it. And we're talking about extreme wealth. We're not just talking about a little amount of money. I mean, it's extreme wealth. And that's how they justify it. We're moving up very quickly to the Civil War, and in the Civil War, we find the first real social welfare by the state and by the government. And the reason being that there was so much casualties in the Civil War. Like 1 million people died in the Civil War. 1 million people were killed, and it was not a small conflagration. And so because of that, you had a lot of people that were disabled, a lot of widows, and so the government sort of stepped in and tried to help some of that. The other thing you had is the freeing of the slaves, and so you had something called the Freedmen's Bureau. Does that ring a bell? The Freedmen's Bureau was set up by the government to provide assistance to freed slaves, because all of a sudden you've got a slave, and they're no longer a slave. Now what? They don't have really any skills. They're not sure of things. And so the Freedmen's Bureau, and as a result, you had elections in the South, you had more African Americans elected to office. You had health care, all of which pissed off the white Southerners to no end. Okay? But that was the beginning of relief activities. Families who lost a breadwinner. Families who lost a breadwinner were helped financially. The sick were helped, and the Freedmen's Bureau was eventually disbanded in about the 1870s. It offered services to help African Americans make the transition from slavery for freedom. It distributed rations to needy Southerners. It functioned as an employment agency, a settlement agency, a health center, and so on. Provided legal assistance and whatnot. And it was dissolved in 1872 by Congress. Now, very briefly, you had a period of industrialization at the end of the Civil War. And this is where we saw a huge amount of immigrants coming into the country, about the late 1800s, early 1900s. We think of places like New York. And people don't realize, for example, that when we talk about New York, do you know that the murder rate in New York was actually higher in 1900 than it is now? Well, actually, we talk about all the crime. Actually, crime is less than it was in the early 1900s, including the murder rate. People lived in tenements. Anybody ever been to New York? You ever been to any of the tenements in New York? I grew up in one of the tenement buildings in New York, and some of the tenements were built like, let me show you. We're kind of built like this. What if you had the building here, and you had a window here, and then you had another building here. You could almost touch the next building from your window. That's how close they were built. Usually about 4 stories high. But what that meant is there was no ventilation. If it's so close, where do you get air? They were dark because you didn't get a lot of light through it. It was I'm not kidding. It's really narrow. You didn't get a lot of light. You didn't get a lot of ventilation. And so as a result of that, you had tuberculosis. You had other diseases. A lot of these places didn't have sanitation. So what did you do? You threw it out the window. You threw it in the street. You didn't have a bathroom. In some of the cases, pigs were a form of sanitation. I was in Nicaragua not so many years ago, in the 80s, and I remember sitting in one of the town centers, and all these pigs, with these big pigs, they could go running around like crazy in the town center. And I thought to myself, no. And they finally explained to me that those pigs are the garbage collectors. That's what they do. That's what the pigs do. They basically eat up anything you throw by the curb. And so you had the same thing in New York. You had people who came off the boat who couldn't speak. If you were an attractive woman, they would stand by the boat in your language, and you'd end up becoming an escort. Well, I didn't even call it an escort, a prostitute. You'd end up becoming a prostitute. You'd end up working in very low wages. They had something called home industries. What was a home industry? I'm making pants, a shirt. Okay, I'm making shirts, right? It's my job. So what do? Instead of going to the factory to work, I work at home. So I go in and I get a bunch of cloth and I take it home, and they have sewing machines. Don't forget, this is the kind of place I worked in. You might have 7 or 8 people in one room, 2 rooms, family of 8 or 9 even. And I piecework. I made the shirts. I took the completed shirts. I took it back, and I got money for it. And I had the whole family working. Sounds like a pretty good deal, except I didn't get very much money. A, and B, they were working in these conditions. Now, if I was lucky or unlucky, I got a job in a factory. And the factories were open from morning to dusk. Why? Because they wanted to save money on electricity for lights. So they stayed open as soon as the sun came out, and they closed when the sun went down. They locked the doors. You couldn't get out once you were in the building. You remember this Triangle Shirtwaist Factory? Anybody remember that? The fire? Where, I don't know how many, I think 100 women jumped off a building and died? And the reason they died is because the employers locked the door. They wouldn't let anybody go to the bathroom. And so once the fire started, they couldn't get out. It was common to lock workers in. You didn't get bathroom breaks. We talked about the Me Too movement, sexual harassment. That's a joke. Then. It was a joke then. Sexual harassment was part of the, you got harassed by the bosses if you were an attractive woman. That's what happened. The working conditions were horrendous. No bathroom breaks. Women could work 50, 60 hours a week. What do you do when you have a kid? You're working 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week. You don't have time for the kids. Sometimes you were forced to work at night because that was the only job you could get. So what happened in the early 1900s, we passed labor legislation that limited the number of hours they can make a woman work and also limited the amount of weight she could lift. And so that was some protections. We had child labor. Children worked at 5 and 6 years old. There wasn't any question of that. And they struck it down in the Supreme Court in the early 1900s, and the Supreme Court said, no, child labor is not illegal. And they reinstituted child labor. You didn't get rid of child labor until the 1920s, before they got rid of child labor. Kids wouldn't go to school, they would be working, at 6 and 7 years old. Mental illness was rampant. Look at these conditions. Can you imagine? Doesn't it make sense that you would have a lot of mental illness? You've got women coming here who are working at home who couldn't speak the language. My grandmother, who died at 86, could not speak English. And she had been in the country for 30 years before she died. She couldn't speak a word of English. She was like a word of English. But, she could, like, simple sentences, I have to go to the bathroom or whatever it is, or I want a piece of cake. Very simple sentences. But she really couldn't speak English. She had been there for 30 years. And so you had a number of particularly women who were in the house who couldn't speak English. They were in a foreign country. They didn't feel. And the men, of course, learned English because they were out working, right? So you had to learn English if you're in the workforce. So you begin to look at all of these conditions, and they were pretty horrendous in cities at the turn of the century. So one of the things they did was the Poverty Society did something which is kind of unusual. You probably may have read about this. They took these street kids. There was a lot of these kids who were living on the street. Man, their parents didn't have the money. They put them on the train and they sent them westward. Anybody know that story? The Children's Aid Society loaded them on a train, sent them westward, with the idea they were going to work on a farm, right? They would get off at the station. The farmers would say, I want you, I want you, I want you. They would take them. They'd go to the next station. Some more farmers would take them. And the assumption, of course, that they were treated well, and they weren't necessarily. They were exploited. They were sexually abused. They were worked half to death. They weren't treated all that well. Some may have been, but a lot of them weren't. And literally, they would go from town to town, and the employees would pick like you would at a rescue society. When you go looking for a dog. You look at the cages and you pick the dog you want, and that was the Children's Aid Society. And they stopped doing that when they realized that these kids were not exactly getting, the kind of home. But the assumption was they were going to live on a farm, and they were going to be robust, and have good food and lots of sun, and they were going to grow up to be healthy, and it just didn't work out that way necessarily. Some it was true for, but others, farmers were looking for cheap help. That's all, So we find a lot of that, and we also find then the emergence of a union movement. My grandmother was one of the early members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in New York, the early 1900s, in the 1900s. You had the labor unions emerging. You had strikes all over the country. Jane Addams, you remember Jane Addams? Jane Addams was involved in the strikes in Chicago. And it was a lot of labor unrest. And they started labor union. I can't go into it too much because we don't have the time, but Samuel Gomper is an AFL-CIO and so on. It's a whole complex history. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So you had this massive industrialization. You had these cities that were really, really rough. And you had the emergence of the settlement house movement. You remember that? You studied the settlement house movement? Okay. All of a sudden, they began to realize Jane Addams started Hull House. Remember that in Chicago? You probably read about Hull House, right? There were 350 settlement houses across the United States by the early 1900s. Actually, my dissertation was written on that, in fact. We also became my first book. And what I argued with the settlement house movement is I said that it was actually fairly conservative. Because the object was to turn immigrants into Americans. What does it mean to become an American? Let me give you an example. Prohibition in the 1920s. What was Prohibition about?
Alcohol.
It's about alcohol. Whenever you study policy, you have to ask yourself what the policy really is about, as opposed to what it says it's about. So, what?
Money.
Money? Control. But something more. It was anti-Catholic. Why do I say it was anti-Catholic? Because drinking is very much a part of Catholic culture, isn't it? You have wine at Mass, right? If you're Irish, you certainly have liquor at wakes, right? No shortage of booze at wakes, right? You have the pubs, the taverns. Workers would go from work home and they would eat, and they would go to the tavern. They would hang out with their friends, and then they would go back home again. Now, good Protestants don't do that, do they? If you're an upstanding middle-class Protestant, you go to work and you go home and you spend time with your family all night long. Right? So by outlawing alcohol, there was an attempt to turn immigrants into middle-class Protestants so that they would go home, they wouldn't go to the tavern, they would stop drinking. They wouldn't be drinking. And it was also about Jews as well, because for Jews, it was also wine was a really important part of the culture. We know what emerged from that, right? The mafia. Because people wanted to drink, and it became a massive industry, right? They just fortune of money. Same thing is happening with drugs now, right? We outlaw drugs, and so there's people that are phenomenally rich now, right? You know? So anyway, so you had all of these movements going on simultaneously. You had the suffrage, the temperance movement, but you also had the suffrage movement in the 1920s. Women were finally given the right to vote. Anybody know which states, which women got the vote earliest? What would you guess? You're probably not going to be able to guess this.
I think you mentioned it last week.
I did.
Something up in north, like Montana. Or
West.
something.
The West.
Wyoming, Utah, Montana.
That's where they got the votes. That's where they got the right to vote. First, they got the right to vote. So you had the suffrage movement. You had the temperance movement. You had the unionization movement. You also had the social gospel movement. And what was the social gospel movement? That was the progressive wing of Christianity, in which they basically said, we, as Christians, we need to reform society. It's our job as Christians to make a better world. I'll give you an example. It's not a Christian example, it's a Jewish example. One of the Jewish stories is something called Tikkun HaOlam. What Tikkun HaOlam means is to repair the world. And in Jewish philosophy, God created an imperfect world. And our job is to make that world more perfect. That's our job. That's Tikkun HaOlam, to repair the world. Okay? The social gospel movement was very much about progressive social change, about repairing the world, about getting rid of these kinds of conditions that we saw in cities, and so on. That was the justification for it. So yeah, it was a very dynamic period. And again, life in 19th century urban America was hard. These people came, when they were in Europe, they were told stories that America was the land of milk and honey. You would arrive in America and all... I think. Yeah, I think so. Uh-oh. Yeah, no. Good. Thank you. She was helping with the video thing. They would arrive in the land of milk and honey. They would come and you'd get instantly rich. And of course that wasn't the case. People came and they were poor. They were not instantly rich, and they were poor for multiple generations. The other thing, medical science had identified the cause of many contagious diseases, but didn't develop strategies. I mentioned Charles Loring Brace wrote a book called The Dangerous Classes in New York. And also, by the way, incredible corruption in graft. Okay. The political system was rife with corruption and graft, and so on. In the midst of this, you also developed two things. You developed eugenics. You know what eugenics is? This idea that there are some people that should not breed. And so there was a great movement to sterilize people who were feeble or who were slow or whatever. And it was a major movement. The other thing that occurred was social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is an interesting concept. Okay? Because, for example, what does Darwin tell you? What is the core of Darwin?
Survival of the fittest.
Exactly. And what happens in the wild for people who are not fit, for animals that are not fit?
They die off.
They die off. And the result is that the next generation, that those who live are stronger, right? Correct? Okay. And this is a continual process of animals dying off. And that strengthens the breed, right? So what about us? If we're supporting the poor through welfare, are we not weakening our species? Because really, as hard as it sounds, shouldn't we let the poor die off? Why are we helping them? Because what do we know about the poor? They breed faster than us, right? The poor have more children, don't they, than the middle class? It's true today as well, right? The poor have more children. So they're having more children, which means they're going to eventually outpopulate us. Right? And they're also less fit. So we need to be strong and not provide benefits for them. We need to let nature take its course. Those of the poor that are able to survive will survive. Those who aren't won't. Does that sound harsh? What?
Yeah, that sounds nice. It's like Sparta.
Look at it today. Look at it now today. We have the same thing going on, don't we? A lot of the white supremacists believe that the Hispanics, Mexican Americans and so on are breeding and are having babies at such a rate that we're going to become minorities in our own society. Isn't it the belief? That white Americans will become a minority as a society becomes browner and blacker and more color. We're going to become a minority. That's one of the reasons they want to stop immigration, right? The fear that the white people will become a minority. Of course, we know that's not true. There's no evidence of that. But nevertheless, that's the belief. Very much the same kind of social Darwinism that we saw at the turn of the century. It's a bit different, but it's the same sort of social Darwinism. Okay. Next week, I'll play you a video tape, a YouTube video of this guy called Taylor. I think it was Jared Taylor, and his conversation with Jorge Ramos. And Jorge Ramos is part of Univision, Mexican American, and it's exactly from what we're talking about now. About we want to be with our own people, white people, and so on. It's a justification in a sense, and it's anti-diversity. He makes an interesting statement too, by the way, which I really thought was the most insane, stupid statement. The guy's not stupid, by the way. Taylor. He said, Jorge Ramos said to him, he said, but weren't your family immigrants? Because the only ones that are not immigrants are Native Americans, right? That's the only ones that are not immigrants, right? And he said, no, my family were not immigrants, they were pioneers. Really? So what's the difference between an immigrant and a pioneer? Of course they were immigrants, right? The country was founded on that. So anyway, so you had a kind of a social Darwinism operating. And they basically used lessons from the natural sciences that could be used in social policy and social engineering. And they tried to apply the principles of natural selection to social affairs. And it was an outgrowth of Darwin's theory of evolution, as I mentioned before, and reasoned that if William Graham Sumner reasoned that if Darwin's laws of evolution determined the development of a species, they could also be applied to laws of society. And again, we get to the survival of the fittest. And if competition for resources is a law of nature, then the poor are poor because they cannot compete against other classes. Conversely, the economic elite are entitled to their spoils because their fitness and competitive abilities.
So are they wrong to think that? If you're coming from a Darwinistic point of view, taking away subjective moralities, if they don't believe in objective moralities, is there wrong in that?
Good question. From their perspective,
Well, they're the supreme race, and they truly feel that way, and they're Darwinists, they don't believe in anything metaphysical. I don't see what the error in that thinking. From a logical point of view, you're right. There's no, but we know that the competition for resources is much more complicated than that. It has to do with who you were born to, where you were born, your parents. Oh, I understand that. I'm just thinking on a objective or subjective point of view for the way that they're interpreting it. I mean, that's like if there's the animal kingdom and there was different species and they felt threatened by an incoming tribe of lions or whatever, then they would have fought them off, chased them off, or whatever. So it just, it's just sparking my mind to think, well, I guess if they're approaching it in that Darwinistic point of view, then it really isn't anything objectively wrong with it. Subjectively wrong, there isn't an objective morality.
Good question. Yeah.
I think the error in their thought is that their strength is man-made. They were given power. If another race was given power first, they would be the strong. But if they were going to look at it as a true Darwin perspective, it would be disease, it would be problems in genes, stuff like that. And they're not looking at it from that perspective. So that's their error.
That's true. And the other thing is,
that in pure Darwinism, no species would have an advantage coming into this, and it's not true for us. You look at Congress, and you look at all the dumb people that are in Congress right now, and the reason they're there is because they happen to be born white, and because they happen to be born of upper class, and they happen to be born with money. But in pure social Darwinism, you wouldn't have that. You would have inequality, right? Everything would be level. But it's not level. Some people are born in a higher status.
Well, but last week you were talking about how the more evolved humanoids started killing off the lesser evolved.
Maybe. I said we don't know.
Oh, well, going off with the Darwinistic theory,
Mm-hmm.
that would just be another layer of evolution to one group of people that they're just using to then suppress the rest. So it doesn't matter what point of view, what level you're at. If you can convert that to a positive and a power and authority that you can then use to suppress other groups or eradicate them, then it really is just another Darwinistic evolution within world society.
To some degree, yes. But again, I mean, again, if everything were level,
No, but evolution is, like you said, it's moving, adapting, and evolving into a different mindset or different place to then become superior
right.
than you were in the past.
But let's say you have two lions, and I have one lion that's a son. My son, whatever what a lion is, whatever the son of a lion is, and my son is pretty hopeless, he's going to die. He's not going to survive. But on the other hand, if I happen to be the Bush family, and I happen to have a son that's pretty slow, he becomes president. Okay? It has nothing necessarily to do with, with his ability. Whereas the lion would be dead. My offspring, who is not capable of surviving, would be dead.
But see, I would think in Darwinistic ideology, it's not just one gender. You're looking back as far as his line goes, and if that line led up to him being there at that point, and he's just taking advantage of that moment. So
Okay.
I mean, we see it as in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. So I don't think it's fair to just look back one generation. I would think, well, the kings or the nobles in his family that pillaged and raided these villages that grew larger empires. So whatever it is, I don't even know the Bush family, but I would just think that it just kind of led up to this spot where they're just taking advantage of, and they're just trying to, I guess, I mean, in a twisted way of thinking, they're just trying to enforce their Darwinistic, ideology by then kicking out the so-called inferior races or people. So I guess if there is no objective morality, then there isn't anything really wrong in what they're trying to do.
Except that we're not animals, and we do have a sense of morality. That's what kept us alive as a species. I mean, otherwise, we don't know that we killed off, by the way, we killed off the lower species. They now have found, in a cave in Israel, actually, they found a skeleton that's 180,000 years old, a modern human, which meant that they lived for thousands and thousands of years together with Neanderthals and other hominids. So if they would have killed them off, they would have killed them off 180,000 years ago, but they didn't.
Okay, well, and I'm just saying this because you're actually sparking some pretty interesting thoughts in my head. It's not like I'm trying to defend the racist
Mhm.
people that are trying to kill off.
Mhm.
No, I'm just trying to see like where that line leads into, because in that Darwinistic ideology there isn't anything metaphysical. Morality is subjective, and for us as social workers to incorporate morality into what we do,
Mm-hmm.
people could give a damn less about morality, So it's just interesting what you're actually kind of making me think about it.
Well, you're right. I mean, in Darwin, there is no morality. There is only survival. There's no moral. You ever see a cat play with a mouse? That's immoral. It plays with it. It doesn't kill it right away. It becomes a toy to it, right? And then finally it kills it, right? They can play with it for an hour, and they let it run, and then they bring it back again, right? I mean, it's really torture, isn't it? I mean, we look at that and we see that it's absolutely immoral. But in nature, there is no morality. I mean, if you look at animals that hunt, What do they hunt? They hunt the weakest of the species of the animals that they're hunting, right? They hunt the old and the young, right? They rarely hunt an animal in the middle of the pack that's strong. You know? But society has grown more complex than simple Darwinism, because we have social strata, we have who you're born to, we have we don't all start in life equally. You know, but that's part of it. I mean, in Darwin, you all start equally, right? Each animal starts equally. We don't start equally. You know, if you happen to be born to a rich family, it's very different. You know, and you can get away with stuff. You know? So, but interesting. These are interesting ideas, and we're seeing some of that. We saw some of that, for example, in The Bell Curve, the book that came out. Anybody know about The Bell Curve? What did The Bell Curve say? The Bell Curve said, for those who don't know, the Bell Curve said that African Americans consistently score less than white people regardless of the test or regardless of their level of social class and education. That they consistently score less on objective tests. So what does that mean? That means that they're less smart than white people, right? You take the meaning of that. That's what the Bell Curve would. That's what you imply from the Bell Curve. But of course, it's simplistic, isn't it? It's much more that goes into it. What are the questions that go into the test? Do those questions benefit? Do those questions would be more familiar to white people than they might be to blacks? Is there an inherent bias in the exam itself? All of those things are operate. But again, the Bell Curve returns to a kind of social Darwinism. So that means then, why should we be investing all of this money in education for African Americans if they're still going to score less? Isn't that the logical? Why are we spending all this money? Why don't we just forget it and just do the minimum of what we need to do? Why are we putting all this money? That's where that kind of logic leads. Okay. So, I mean, I talked about the social gospel movement, and the social gospel movement emerged in a sense as a reaction to social Darwinism. To say, you know, as Christians, we have a higher moral bar than pure Darwinism. Okay. And I'm going to stop with this as one part. Religion and social welfare are inextricably linked. Earliest social work and social welfare came out of a religious impulse. That's what it came out of. Okay, who were your earliest social workers? People who worked in it. Necessarily social workers are people who were affiliated with the church. They were friendly visitors, right? They would go to people's houses. They would provide what's called outdoor relief, meaning aid in someone's house. But on the other hand, they weren't all that. Well, you wouldn't get away with stuff now. What they did, for example, they might say to people, "We'll give you aid, but you have to kneel and pray with us. You have to stop drinking. You have to do this. You have to do that." They would go in and they would assess what they could sell, and they'd say, "We'll give you aid, but you've got to sell all of your stuff before you can get aid." By the way, when I was in Minnesota, this was in 70s actually, no, 80s, early 80s, there was a welfare department in the neighboring county in which the welfare workers made recipients bend down and pray with them before they gave them their checks. So it didn't just go on then, okay? Now, if you're a recipient and you need that money to make it to the end of the week, you're going to get down. I would get down there and pray. I'm not even religious. You know, and yeah, I mean, what do I need to do? Yeah, all right. That's fine. I'll do it. You know, just give me the check. So we have this concept of a quid pro quo. You know, we will give you something, but in return, you have to give us something. And what also occurred in that period of time, and I'll stop with that, is that people also ended up going to different churches to get different relief. Because there wasn't any coordination. So I'd be bouncing around from church to church saying I'm poor. And I would get relief and I'd go to the next church. And I would say I'm poor because there was no records. You know? And so finally we developed a charity organization society, was an attempt to systematize welfare so that one church would know what the other church was giving, and so people couldn't be abusing the welfare. Any comments or questions what he talked about? Now go home and think about how you're a social Darwinist. See you next week. Do you see the relationship of this to policy?